Welcome to the Wisdom Chat podcast. I'm your host, Phil Holdsworth, founder and director of Aurum Gold. And my co-host is Rachel Surtees, the rambling psychotherapist. Hi there, Rachel.
Hi, Phil. Nice to see you again.
And you. And we're here to guide you through candid, easy listening conversations with industry insiders from a wide spectrum to talk all things on money and well-being. And today we're joined by Teresa Davidson and Rosie Lyon to talk about divorce and money. Teresa is a family lawyer and partner at Winston Solicitors in Leeds, and Rosie is a vulnerability specialist, a UK inclusion and diversity rep, and a wellbeing advocate for the Allied Irish Bank. And I'll get my teeth sorted out. So get comfortable and let's dive into Wisdom Chat podcast.
Hi guys, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us and for being willing to come and talk to us about your expertise and experience today. We really appreciate your time. It'd be really nice though for the listeners just to have a bit of an understanding about a little bit more about what it is that you do, where you're coming from, what your standpoints might be. So if you could open up with just a little bit about the work that you do and what experience you might be bringing to this chat, that would be great. Rosie, would you like to go first?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for having me. So as Phil said, my name's Rosie Lyon and I work in the banking sector as a vulnerability specialist. I specialise mainly in domestic, financial and economic abuse. I'm qualified in financial and economic abuse. However, I deal with multiple different types of vulnerability. I've won awards and been nominated for awards for the work that I do in the banking sector. I'm also a divorce coach, so I help people go through divorce and separation, whether that be in an abusive situation or a non-abusive situation, to help them think clearly about what they're going through and basically holding their hand as such, going through the procedure of it all, because it can be very daunting and quite traumatic as well. So that's a little bit about me.
Fabulous. Thank you for that. It seems we're both missing our teeth today, Phil. Teresa, could you tell the listeners a little bit more about yourself, please?
Hi, yes. Hi, both. Thank you for having me. And lovely to meet Rosie as well and hear about what she does. So as Phil said, I'm a lawyer, a solicitor working in a law firm in Leeds. I specialise in family law and I've done that for the last, I don't really want to say how long, but anyway, well over 20 years. And on a day-to-day basis, what I'm doing is working with clients who are going through a divorce, and the majority of that time is spent really dealing with their financial settlements, so helping them navigate that, whether that's outside of the court forum in some form of negotiation or alternate dispute resolution, or within the court process if that's needed. Over the years, I've worked with a whole spectrum of clients in respect of that. I started out my working life as a solicitor, working in a legal aid practice, primarily working with clients who got the benefit of legal aid. We might come on to talk about that, the sort of lack of availability of legal aid these days. But more recently, I work solely with clients who are sort of paying privately, so not always hugely wealthy clients, but at a sort of spectrum where they can obviously afford to pay for that advice and support.
That's brilliant, Teresa. Thank you so much. I'd just like to extend my thanks to you both for joining us as well. I'm just thinking about the process. I mean, I worked in money and debt advice, and one of the things that we came across oftentimes was something like 1 in 4 relationships broke down because of money conflict. And we're not just talking about money, because there are all manner of reasons why people find themselves in a situation where they're going to separate, divorce, and the trauma that brings, the reasons that lead up to it and the trauma it brings. what are some of the things that you are commonly seeing that's leading people to go down this route? Teresa, I don't know if you just want to start on that, but.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, Phil, there's a whole myriad of reasons why people's relationships break down. I suppose what I would say is that there's pretty much always going to be a financial element to sorting that out, whether the financial tensions have been the trigger for the relationship breakdown or whether that's totally unrelated to why the marriage has broken down. There's always going to be a financial element that's got to be sorted out one way or another. And usually the people that I'm seeing are coming to me because that's not straightforward. You know, many people obviously do resolve the end of their marriage or their relationship without having to come to somebody like me as a lawyer. They might come to me because they need some formality around what they've agreed, but you know, they've largely agreed what they're doing about the children, about the house, about their finances. So what I tend to see is people who it's not as straightforward. They're not as able to navigate that as other people. And quite often that tends to be because they have a lack of information about the family finances. And this sort of probably touches more on the area that Rosie's dealing with people in. You know, even in situations where you wouldn't say, you know, my clients wouldn't say, and somebody standing outside of the marriage wouldn't say that there had been any sort of economic abuse necessarily. There are a lot of relationships where there's a huge imbalance of information and power around the finances. And I'm often seeing people who come to me and just say, I don't even know where to begin. I don't know what we've got. I don't know what we pay out. I don't know what I'm entitled to. And I just have no idea how to navigate this situation now. And I am understandably terrified about where my future lies, because I just don't know how to get through it. And I don't know what my life and my financial life is going to look like on the other side of that process.
Yeah. And yourself, Rosie, I mean, what are some of the thoughts that you have around this when people's, you know, come to that point of deciding we need to separate, we need to divorce? Or
yeah, that's it. In some of the cases that I see, especially if it's a domestic abuse situation, it's very difficult. It's not a case where they can just be like, right, I'm going to divorce and separate and leave, because some people, as we know, can struggle to leave a situation that they're in due to multiple different reasons. But it's obviously a very hard thing to go through, especially, as Teresa said, if you don't understand what you're entitled to, how the divorce proceedings work. And that's something that you have to consider. And it's a lot of stress as well. You know, it's the second most traumatic thing that you'll go through in life, divorce or separation, the first being death. And I don't think people really realise that as such, and the impact that can have on people in their daily life as well. And we see it quite a lot. And with the finances side of things, it's very difficult, and it's something that people, you know, they can reach out to different charities or even their bank, which people don't really think to do, to get that support that they may need.
Yeah. I suppose that there's a couple of things here, isn't there? We talk about finances, that can be a contributory factor to relationships breaking down, but also there can be other factors which really impact our well-being, our mental health. I mean, in terms of the impact psychologically on a person, I have supported a number of friends who have gone through the whole process, and these primarily, not all of them, primarily been male friends who have been on the receiving end of a breakdown of relationship and have just observed those initial days, as Teresa, you were saying, where people just don't know what to do and don't know what to say, don't know where to look. In fact, they just can't seem to cognitively get their minds around it. Is that something that you're both seeing, you know, in the initial stages, or does it take some time for them to come and talk with you first? Teresa, how about yourself?
I think people vary enormously. I mean, I see a lot of people who are thinking about separation and want to be kind of pre-armed. You know, they want to know what their rights are, they want to know where they stand before they start that process. And then I also see a lot of people who are in those very early days, as you say, Phil, where the emotions have just taken over, because either because they have decided that, you know, that's the end of the relationship, or perhaps it's been sprung on them by their partner and they didn't necessarily see it coming. And I think that people do need time to deal with that emotional, particularly first emotional shock is hugely severe for people. Sometimes I think they're in a position where getting armed with some practical information, some practical legal advice massively helps them, because they feel like that's a bit of a support that they can sort of hold on to. I think for other people, they're just not ready really to start to think about those practical things.
I'm interested in this a little bit. So coming at this from the psychotherapy point of view, when you're talking about shock, it's a nervous system dysregulation. And when your nervous system becomes dysregulated, it's in that kind of fight flight mode. Your executive function goes offline. So your ability to think clearly and to process information and so on and so forth will, to some degree or other, sometimes a little bit, sometimes a lot, dependent on how dysregulated you become, will just go offline. So I think what you're talking about there, Teresa, is the people who are not ready. It's not necessarily a case of they're not necessarily ready to accept or ready to, they might just not actually be physically capable, because the nervous system is so dysregulated they're incapable of processing. So it's an interesting thing. I'm not suggesting you view it like this at all, but some people, I would imagine, particularly in a divorce situation, when the partner is on the other side with the solicitor, they're going, oh, well, they're just resisting. They're just resisting. So there might be a little bit of misunderstanding going on there between people. Is that something you encounter?
I think definitely. I mean, clearly, you know, I'm not qualified in the way that you are to assess it in that way, but certainly on a practical level, over years of dealing with these situations, I'll quite often be having discussions with clients around the fact that even if, for example, they are ready to process it, their partner might not be. And therefore, you know, if they're the person who's ready to start thinking about the practicalities of where they're going, there might just, it's just, you know, in order to negotiate something, you need to have two people who are both able to process it and able to, you know, emotionally ready to make those steps. And actually that inability on perhaps one side, I don't mean deliberate inability, but, you know, there's no criticism implied there, but, you know, that inability to be ready for that can continue for a really, really long time. And so sometimes you'll have clients who, as you say, are getting very frustrated and think that, you know, their ex-partner is trying to be difficult or trying to, you know, play a game or be tactical, when actually what's going on is they just aren't in the right place yet to do that. And I'm quite often talking to clients, not in a clinical sense like you would be, but, you know, tell me about your partner, tell me how they work and how they think, because if they're not ready, you know, we're going to have to take that into account in how we try and resolve this, and what processes we use as well. What process are they going to feel safe enough in to start to make those decisions?
Absolutely, absolutely. Rosie, it looks like you might be waiting to say something there. Have you got something on this subject?
Yeah, so I mean, like, I agree. Like, you know, when people find out that they're going to be separating, whether it is out of the blue, or they come to a mutual agreement, it's a form of grief in a way, isn't it? It's like grieving for someone that has gone out of your life, and they could have been there even for a small period of time or a long period of time, but they've meant something to you within that period of time, and they're no longer going to be there. But they haven't, as you know, we say grief is more like we grieve for someone that's passed away. They haven't passed away as such, but they've left. So, you know, that's very emotionally, like, you know, traumatic for some people, that they can't, whether, you know, they can't get to grips with, like, you know, that the relationship's over, or having to deal with being on their own, or, you know, and different other things that factor into divorce and separation as well. And, you know, as Teresa said, like, some people won't be ready for that. They just, if they're not there emotionally, they need to be there for themselves and be able to have worked on themselves and be ready for that before they can take the next step. However, obviously, in some circumstances, and with clients that I would deal with, is the fact that not always is that the case, that's why the hold up is. It could be the case that if someone, say for instance, if domestic abuse is taking place, then there'll be hold ups, because that's a form of obviously economic and financial abuse, coercive control, to hold it up as long as possible, to build up the sort of fees, whether that be in solicitor fees, you know, even counselling fees, or fees for missed payments, for instance, or making them continue to pay for a property that they don't live in. So, you know, there's two different sort of sides of that, I guess.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you're saying that. So, for example, what would you say to somebody who have come to that point of recognizing I need to do something, and I'm experiencing, you know, financial and economic abuse, and this relationship needs to end? I know we've got a bit of a journey before that for some people, haven't there? Because there's that situation where people say, "Oh, it'll change. It'll change. The other person will improve," or, you know, there's this sort of trying to convince yourself, or maybe it's just me, or what have you. But then when they come to that point, what would you say to them, Rosie, in terms of what would be or what would you recommend their first step be?
Yeah, I mean, you get people that come to me and, you know, they want to leave, but they're not sure how to, or they have to consider all the different steps, all different sort of scenarios and different things that they'd have to go through with that. You know, I've had clients where they've been in situations of domestic, financial, economic abuse for a long period of time. They want to leave, but then they decide against it because of the financial part of it, or whether they have children, for instance, you know, like with the family courts, for instance, you know, having to go through all that with children, with custody and all different other things that they might not. But I think, you know, once they're ready, it's sort of being able to listen, obviously believe what they're saying as well. Belief's a big thing for anybody that has disclosed domestic abuse. It's being able to have a safe space for that individual. And then it's also for the signposting. So, for instance, if there was somebody that did want to leave and they were currently living with an individual that was abusive, then obviously it's not a case that they can just unfortunately walk out the door or say I'm leaving now, because 9 times out of 10 it's not going to be possible like that. So they'd have to have a safety plan in place, and that's something that a divorce coach that specialises in domestic abuse can help with, the help of other charities as well for signposting, so the likes of Women's Aid or the Mankind Initiative as well for, you know, and LGBTQ, you know, all the different sort of domestic abuse charities that have the helplines that will be able to support and give advice on that in order for them to leave. And then once that part is done, and when they're ready to, because as I say, sometimes they decide actually, no, I don't want to do it now. And that's fine. That's it. That's their decision, and that's entirely up to them. Then that's when you go to the next stage of what's the next bits that have to be dealt with.
Yeah, I know, Rachel, you wanted to say something. Can I just say, I'm just mindful of the fact that in a situation like that you described, Rosie, fear and uncertainty themselves will be quite palpable in many respects and create an awful lot of stress and anxiety. And I'm just kind of mindful of a person in those situations, what it must feel like for them. So to actually come to a point of deciding, I need to get out, that's a big step for them, isn't it?
It is, it really is. And sometimes it could be something where they've been thinking about it for a while, or this sort of thing that we say, like a light bulb moment, where it could be just something simple, and then one day they're like, I need to leave, and that could be years later, but it's just that light bulb moment, or that moment that they've planned up to where they're like, right, I'm ready now. Yeah, and it is the fear, the anxiety, the future telling, like what if, what's going to happen next, and thinking the worst case scenarios. And it's trying to get support and have that support to be able to stay in the moment and take one step at a time, because some people can only do one thing a day, for instance, because the emotional impact it has is so draining on an individual.
I'm really aware that we're talking about this, or you're talking about this from the or looking at it through the lens of domestic abuse, but I think a lot of the stuff can be cross-referenced into divorce generally, actually.
Yeah.
So you can get people who have not been in abusive situations, who've been in marriages for years and years and years, and just been generally unhappy, thinking about leaving for years, and it takes a long, long time. Again, I guess I could say a little bit about the science of that, the psychology of that. We as human beings are primed to prioritize attachment as our primary safety mechanism. So if we do anything that threatens our attachment, we get a bit of a fight-flight response. So the thought of leaving a long-term relationship with a person who's become our primary attachment figure will trigger that fight-flight response in us, and then we stop thinking straight, and so on and so forth. So it can take years and years and years for somebody to come to the conclusion that actually they need to leave and start to do something about it. I'm kind of hearing you say that it sounds like you do a lot of signposting. I've just seen Teresa indicate that she wants to say something on this as well, though. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hand over to Teresa, because it sounds like she's got something to say or a question around this.
I was just going to say that I think the themes are really common across a lot of separating couples from what Rosie's saying. So even if you don't have a situation where it's definitely been abusive, coming to that decision is just so hard for so many people for the reasons you've talked about, Rachel. I think what I've noticed over the last sort of 20 odd years, and I think the stats would back me up in terms of the number of older couples getting divorced, is that there has been a change in attitudes to people separating, which depending on your point of view, you think is positive or not. And I think part of that is the whole conversation about domestic abuse and coercive control, etc., that people are so much more alive to those issues and feel so much more able to consider those within their own relationships. And I've acted for a lot of clients who've been together for I think my oldest client, by the time we finished her divorce, was well into her 70s. And you would get other people who would say, well, why on earth would you bring a marriage to an end after being together for sort of 50 years? Why would you do that? And yet for her, it was absolutely the right decision for her personal circumstances, not coming out of an abusive relationship, but it was still the right decision for her. But to get to that point after all of those years and grown-up children and grandchildren and all of the connections, all of the family connections that involves, is enormous for people. It's a huge undertaking for people to come to terms with.
Absolutely. I would imagine the sunk cost fallacy plays a little bit of a role in that as well. We've put so many years into this, why would you give it up now, sort of thing. I guess the thing that was playing in my mind as I stuck my hand up to start talking was what I'm hearing Rosie say is that she does a lot of time posting for people so that they get the support that they need and so on and so forth. And my point is that even when there isn't abuse, I would imagine that people need support that falls outside of the remit of the you two guys. So do you find yourself signposting or like sending people off to, I don't know, the likes of me or coaches or charitable support, etc., etc.? Do you find that a lot in these situations?
Yes, I mean, it does vary. It does vary with clients, the extent to which they feel they need that. I mean, it's definitely something that I would discuss with people. I mean, the idea of divorce coaches is kind of a relatively recent one, I think. Obviously, prior to that, it was more around counselling and psychotherapy sort of support for people. But yeah, definitely, because at the end of the day, what I do is, you know, you want to be empathetic and you want to be supportive, but I am there to be their lawyer and to take them through certain practical processes. Ultimately, I'm not the person who's best qualified and best placed to give them that support. So yeah, we have clients who will use a whole kind of range of those resources, from the type of charitable resource that Rosie's talked about. Sometimes just other professionals, you know, they will talk to their bank, Rosie, you know, they will talk to their accountant, they'll talk to their financial advisor, they'll talk to a whole range of people. And also, referring back to what Phil said, you know, a lot of people get really, really good practical support from their friends and family. And that's really, really important in this situation, particularly if those friends and family can be, how can I put it, a sort of slightly more neutral sounding board, you know, not necessarily just sort of jumping on the bandwagon of, you know, thinking that their ex is the worst person in the world and that, you know, everything would have been rosy otherwise. So yeah, that's hugely important for people. And, you know, often when I do go to court, although it's not particularly often because we try and avoid that, but when I am going to court with clients, you know, they will often want somebody there in support. They want a second pair of ears. They want somebody as a sounding board to just help them in their decision making. And that's massively helpful for them in this process.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, so we've sort of established, you know, the sort of beginnings of the process and how long that can take to get to that point, and some of the resources that people can sort of tap into, whether it's from friends and family, often just being a, you know, listening ear, or, you know, an emotional support. And I know I've been that myself for some people. But then they're taking those steps. And I'm just conscious of, what does that often look like? Now, I know it can be different if it's, say, coming out of an abusive situation. There are other elements involved in that. But there's no doubt things that cross both of your paths, in a sense, in terms of the next steps. So I'm just thinking about our listeners and who may be themselves in a situation and they're wondering, so what does happen? How does the process start to work out? And what are some of the things that maybe I need to anticipate along that journey? Just your thoughts, Therese, initially on that.
Yeah, I think the really important thing for people is to arm themselves with as much information as possible, because I think whatever process you end up going down, and I can talk about some different ways that can happen, the more information you've got at the beginning of that process, the easier that is going to be. The most difficult cases that I deal with is where I'm acting for a client who really doesn't have any insight into the family finances at all, and their partner is unwilling to provide them with that information. And in those extreme situations, and I would say that they are the least common scenario, that's really where you are falling back very much on the court process. And while most people will want to avoid courts, certainly in relation to financial matters, it is a really important tool in your armory when you've got a situation where you just can't get the information that you need to move forward and to make any decisions, because you can't negotiate a settlement in a situation where you don't know what you're dealing with.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's really important for people. I would say the vast majority of people who come to see me and want to sort out their finances, if they've not already reached an agreement, we start off with an information gathering process. And ideally, you would do that outside of any formal court process. You would gather the information, you would swap the information. So, two partners each gather their own information and then swap it. Sometimes you need some expert evidence. I deal with quite a lot of cases where people have got businesses or other slightly more complicated assets, and you need some expert input into that. And then it's really down to the individuals and what process is going to work best for them. So some people will go to mediation and sort it out in the context of mediation and come back and say to me, right, we've reached a deal. I had a client who emailed me this morning saying exactly that. We've done a deal in mediation. Can you help us draft it up and make sure that it's legally watertight? And that's a big part of what I do. For other clients, it's about a more assisted process of resolution. So we do a lot of what we call a financial dispute resolution hearings or appointments, where the parties have got all of the financial information they need, and then we will appoint somebody to act as an independent individual. They're not an arbitrator, although you can go to arbitration, and they're not a mediator, but they are there to help them, with the benefit of their lawyers, negotiate a settlement. And that is a hugely successful process for a lot of people, and that can happen entirely outside of the court process as well. So I think people have got sort of the benefit of both. They're reaching an agreement, so they're keeping control, they're keeping autonomy over their financial decisions, but they're not going head to head with their former partner on their own, which they might not feel comfortable with. They've got some help and some guidance.
Would you say it's quite common for, in a situation like that, where there's a breakdown of relationship, where would you say you see more that are not so amicable, or the opposite?
Oh, it's a huge range, and also it changes over time. It changes over the period when I'm acting for clients. So it's a little bit like we started off saying, and Rachel was saying, people come there in the heat of the breakdown. They're going through that grief process that Rosie's talks about. But then gradually over time, they get to a point where the issues start to settle, they start to resolve, and they can see a bit more clearly where they want to end up. And sometimes just on a very practical level, it costs money to have a huge court battle and to fight over every last penny of your money or every last item that you've got to resolve. And for most people, I would say, that I act for, eventually they resolve it. It's quite rare to ultimately have to say, to a judge in court, okay, we've got two people, they've been trying their best, they can't resolve it. Usually those tend to be cases where either one person won't provide the information, so they're from the outset, they're just not providing the information that you need, and they've dug in, and you have to go to court to get to the bottom of what there is. Or sometimes there's quite a complicated legal argument about how those assets should be resolved. Right. But for most people, that's not the case.
So you get some who could be quite sort of belligerent, and then also the more complex would be to do with things like what assets are involved. Like you mentioned, safer business is involved. You know, it's not so clear cut in many respects. What are your thoughts, Rosie, on that and experience?
Yeah, I guess, you know, with going through the divorce period, it's very difficult, or it can be, you know, it can be amicable, you know, but, you know, one thing that I always say from a banking perspective, not talking on behalf of all banks, but banks in general, is that we can actually support people. So for instance, if they don't know what sort of, there is some instances where they do have, their partner does do all the finances and they don't even know their bank account details, you know, say it's the joint bank account, you know, but they know the bank. They can contact the bank and they can ask for what products are in their name and get that information for them and stuff like that. They can also, obviously, we're there to support customers. Generally, I feel I actually do speak on behalf of all banks there. We are there for our customers. So we're there to support them through difficult times, you know, and give them their options as well from a financial point of view. And if they need that support, then we can provide it to them, whether that be for joint bank accounts and how to manage joint finances, or how to split from a joint bank account, or, you know, or if there is a mortgage or a loan that's joint, and what we can do to support them during that time, whether it's because they can't afford their repayments, or if they want to, you know, settle it in some way, then we can help them through that. We have specialised teams in banks that deal with all that, and we can support them during that time. And in regards to divorce coaching, then obviously we're there to support them emotionally when they're, you know, because we all have bad days. Even, you know, when you're going through a divorce or separation, some days you could be like, that's great, but other days you could be really struggling and you need someone to talk to. And, you know, we always do a little sort of checklist of stuff of people to have or consider in your life during divorce. So solicitor being one of them, counsellor being another, GP if they need any sort of medical help as well. And then, as support with family, friends, charities, government organisations such as, you know, Money Helper, to work out their budget using budgeting tools and different elements like that, really, to help them through the difficult periods.
Can I just say before handing over to Rachel that one of the things I come across, and I suppose in some respects I ought not to be surprised, but and I've seen it in my own family setting, where one person has been in control of the finances, and I don't necessarily mean in terms of an abusive control, but more just the fact that, you know, between the two, one person had responsibility for the money and the other person was happy for that. But all of a sudden, they not only do they not know what money's available and where it is, but also they've not actually sat down and even done something like a spending plan. And it's quite, you know, I can imagine for those, it can be quite frightening being in those situations. But yeah, I mean, I had a family member who, this wasn't to do with divorce, it was actually to do with a partner passing away and needing a friend, a solicitor friend, to help them understand where was the money. They didn't know what they had, so they thought they were quite vulnerable and quite poor. It turned out that they needn't worry about money anymore. But it took a friend, a solicitor friend, to actually hunt down where all this money was because of the behaviour of their partner in sort of squirreling it away into different pots, thinking they knew what they were doing, but they clearly, now looking back, didn't know what they were doing. So that's an interesting one. But I'll hand over to yourself, Rachel.
So I'm aware that, like, we could talk, it sounds like, till the cows come home on this topic, but it's a huge topic that we could dive into, isn't it? But we are sort of running out of time for today. But I think what I'm really noticing is that what we're talking about a lot here is breakdown in communication. So not just breakdown in relationship, but also breakdown in communication, or a lack of communication in the first place. As you both alluded to, people coming into this situation with no information, you know, that's due to a lack of communication in the first place. And it really sounds like what we're talking about here, be that using a lawyer, be that using a divorce coach, be that drawing on your resources such as your banks or your accountants or whatever, is that support is often, not always, because I do know people do handle divorces by themselves, but support is often needed in divorce cases, just to help people bridge that communication gap. Do you guys have anything to say on that?
I think definitely, Rich, and when you were talking, what I was thinking about was, and I know, you know, I've heard other people, particularly in the banking sector, talk a lot about why do we not teach our children more financial information, you know, how to handle a bank account, what is a bank account, what's a credit card, how does it work? You know, as Phil said, lots of couples divide up the jobs in their relationships, marriages, and, you know, one of them deals with the money and one of them deals with something else. And that doesn't necessarily, there's nothing untoward about that. But to go through your life sort of not having an understanding of where you stand financially, I just think that there's such a lot of work we could be doing at a much more basic stage for people, whether they're ever going to divorce or not, about just understanding how those things work. And I think that then the sort of fear that they feel when they do find themselves in a situation where, you know, clients are coming to me would be so much less, because they would understand what a budget looked like, or how, and it's not a criticism of people. I just think that it's not something we focus on as being important for people. And I just think for most of my clients, what's most important to them and what they get most benefit from is just that feeling of autonomy. I know where I stand, I know where I'm going to be, I know what I can live on, I know what my budget's going to be. I'm taking back control of my life and my financial life. And it's, you know, it's massively liberating for a lot of people, even though they might not have chosen to find themselves in that situation.
Absolutely. Rosie, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, support is really important. I think support is just for anything really, but yeah, it is important. It's important to be able to have people there, whether that be a bank to, you know, help with your accounts, obviously a solicitor to help with the divorce process, but some people do it by themselves, but generally a professional in that sense, and then for their own mental well-being, because as we said, it's a very challenging time, so ensuring that they take time out for themselves, that they get the support and the help that they need, whether that be through counselling, through their GP, talking to a friend, you know, so that they're able to focus on their self as well during this difficult time.
I'm just going to add to that, and so that when it comes to helping people understand their psychology around money, one of the most common things, somebody like myself involved in the finance industry, we would be more planners and think very carefully about security. Oftentimes people who are dominant in that feeling of security, it's to do with money making them feel safe. And people who are dominant in planning, you know, it's having that plan and knowing what's happening ahead. And it's interesting when you have a plan, also those uncertain times when you can have a plan around those times. Actually, it actually brings more stability, and it brings a better ability to think more rationally, because you've got the full information in front of you. But it's interesting, even people who just need to feel safe, and they're concerned about their finances and have they got enough and how they're going to survive and how they're going to pay the bills. Their sense of security could be brought not necessarily by having more money, but actually having a plan. And so being able to talk with people like yourselves is going to have quite a significant impact, both in terms of knowing there is somebody there I can talk to. There's somebody there who knows the kind of journey and also can point me in the right direction for anything else that I actually need. And like the family member I spoke of, who had a friend who's a solicitor, was able to identify, where monies was, what was available, and in some cases possibly even help somebody sit down and even teach them how to budgeting. Because your point, Teresa, about schools, absolutely valid point. The Welsh Assembly talked about one of their rules is about the importance of financial education being in the national curriculum. But my question, listening to them talking about it, was, but what does that look like actually for a kid in a classroom? And a kid in a classroom can actually think, well, this is maths, and not even equate it to money, because we've not actually talked about it in that framework. So you can imagine an adult who also feels like that, lots of other psychological things going on when they're realizing, actually, I ought to know about this, but I don't. So thank you both very much for that. And Rachel, have you got anything more you want to ask or say?
No, I would just like to say again, thank you very much. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of this topic, and I've got all sorts of questions spiraling off the back of it, and I'm going, oh my gosh, more podcast titles, excellent. So thank you very much for joining us, sharing your wealth of knowledge and expertise and inspiring us. I would like to invite you both, however, to let the listeners know if they ever wanted to access your support, or they knew somebody who they wanted to put in touch with you, how could they get a hold of you? So Teresa, how's best to get hold of yourself?
So probably have a look on our firm's website. So that's winstonsolicitors.co.uk. You can find me on there, get my mobile number, contact me on my mobile, whenever you need anything. Yeah, happy always to have a chat with people. No commitment, no obligation, just have a chat and see if I'm the right person to help them, really.
I love chatting with you, it's why I invited you along. So I might be biased, but I'm going, I love having a chat with Teresa. How about you, Rosie?
Yeah, the main thing to contact me on would be on LinkedIn, if people have LinkedIn. So that would be Rosie Lyon, Lyon, just because people spell my name wrong quite a lot, but that's fine if they do. But yeah, Rosie Lyon on LinkedIn.
Fabulous. And it's been an absolute pleasure meeting and chatting with you today as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both very much from me also. And all the very best going forward.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.